the approach I want to take is to not only talk about Afghanistan, but to talk about the broader context of the war on terror. Because, of course, the invasion of Afghanistan was, in many respects, the inception of an open ended war that, unlike any other war this country had conducted, was a war not against a specified government or a military, but a war against a method, a technique that was employed primarily by non-state actors, right? And it has gone on for 20 years now. I think you're aware that we are just a couple weeks from marking the 20th anniversary of the attacks of September 11th, 2001, that launched the war on terror. And perhaps the withdrawal of American troops from Afghanistan marks the beginning of the end of the war on terror. And so I want to ask about what we're learning in and about Afghanistan, but also what we might learn in terms of thinking about a post-war on terror American foreign policy and, more generally speaking, approach to national security. And having said that, I will immediately say this is not my area of scholarly expertise by any stretch. It's not an area, to be honest, that I've spent a lot of time thinking about recently. And so I'm talking with you about it today because I know it's on all of our minds and because the issues are urgent. But my approach is going to be primarily to raise questions and make suggestions. And I just want to be clear, if I become too confident, please take that with a grain of salt. I'm not in a position to have a lot of confidence in speaking on these subjects. So what are some initial impressions from the Taliban takeover in Afghanistan and the US withdrawal? Could be viewed. I think that the dominant impression right now is that this is a disaster, that this was poorly administered, that it's creating a perilous situation on the ground for many Americans, for many of our allies. And ultimately, it's producing chaos and potentially a human rights nightmare for the people of Afghanistan. So is that indicative of the fact that Joe Biden made the wrong decision, that he should not have withdrawn American troops from Afghanistan? Or is this, in the way that I think I'd like to view it, a good decision, but one that was poorly executed? And so let me start with Joe Biden and note that Joe Biden has felt for the better part of around a decade that the US should get out of Afghanistan, that he was in the minority in Barack Obama's cabinet in pushing to withdraw troops, and that he has been getting considerable resistance for a decade as he's made this case from officials in the US military, as well as in the national security and intelligence community. And that this then raises the question, was Biden in a rush to do this? And in particular, was he suspicious of military intelligence? Did he disregard some of the advice he was getting? And is that based in the fact that he views the military as having misled the civilian decision makers about the prospects for success in Afghanistan for nearly 20 years now, and that he therefore discounted some of the advice he was getting? I'm not sure about that, but it seems like a very plausible scenario. Bob, you had your hand up. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, everybody seems to be blaming Biden for this. And in my mind, the big culprit is the military, their intelligence and their execution. And, you know, they're supposed to figure this stuff out. He just makes the decision, says, go ahead and do it. And they did not do anything right.
Well,
and Perhaps because they didn't have appropriate intelligence when Milley comes up and says, no, we had no idea that this was going to happen. Why in the hell didn't they have an idea?
Well, I think, and we'll just have to see, that the history of this will reveal that at least some people within the national security and military intelligence community did have an idea that something like this was going to happen. Maybe not with the rapidity with which it occurred, right? You know, they thought 18 months and it turned out to be closer to 18 days. But I think there are some indications making their way out to the press already that there were at least some people who were saying, no, this could happen really fast. And I do want to get into how deep the misunderstanding of the military's, how deep the military misunderstood the Afghani theater 20 years into a campaign. And I don't want to discount that, but having said that, I do, from what I hear, there were voices in the room saying this could go south very quickly. John, go ahead.
David, you're hearing those voices because those guys, anybody with a faintest claim to having ever said anything is instantly trying to get into print to show he or she was on the right side of this discussion. But the real question comes down, I mean, obviously Biden is, as Bob says, Biden is dependent on the intelligence that he's getting. It would be really interesting to see what the national intelligence estimates that he gets every morning in a briefing had said over the previous 3 or 4 weeks. You know, with that's the official judgment that's being passed along. I mean, there's 10,000 people doing intelligence in Washington. There's like 8 different agencies. Somewhere in there, somebody's always saying anything, you know, and but it has to be the sort of combined judgment. And the combined judgment, if the Joint Chiefs and the defense estimate had said, you know, if you do this, this is going to, if you pull out too rapidly, it's going to be a disaster. Biden isn't nuts. He wouldn't have done that. And so it does, I go quite along with Bob that the main responsibility here, well, the long-term responsibility is the mindset of the whole foreign policy establishment in Washington. But the short-run one is the failure of these extraordinarily expensive and intelligent people, you know, to have it's not a failure of the people, it's a failure of the process that just produces this kind of result, always in favor of the Pentagon and the, you know, continued military, whatever in the United States can, well, blah, blah, blah. But anyway, that's my take on it.
All right, and it looks like
it seems to me that the idea, the fact that it's going fast and messy is not the worst outcome. Slow and deliberate would be worse. More people killed, you know, I mean, a slow withdrawal means another 20 years. And that certainly is not better than a fast and messy withdrawal.
Yeah, and so clearly this was a fast withdrawal, but I think the question is really about the rate at which the Afghan military, and I'm tempted to say collapsed, but I think dissolved might even be the better term, right? It just kind of faded away without even fighting, as far as we can tell, at least with most of the troops. And then the Afghan government very quickly also withdrew. Of course, a government without a military facing a military adversary is not going to be in power for long, but it showed absolutely no staying power either. William, you had your hand up, right?
Yes. Well, according to yesterday's journal, approximately 24 State Department employees at the Kabul embassy sent a memo to Lincoln saying, basically telling them what's going to happen and saying, well, if we don't do it, it's going to be a disaster. In effect, So we're talking, so it's not just military intelligence, it's the State Department recommendation too that he went against. Not the whole State Department, but 20 officials anyway.
Yeah. Okay. Wilma, go ahead. Wilma, okay.
Yeah. I don't want to discount the fact that the Taliban have had a very brilliant campaign going on. And I read someplace that what they did was negotiate with all of these municipalities across the northern part of Afghanistan, where they have not before had a toehold, and prearranged their taking over. And so by the time they entered, wanted to get to Kabul, they had the rest of northern Afghanistan pretty much sewed up. So it just went boom. But our biggest mistake was tolerating the corruption of the governments there for 20 years. So there was no popular support.
So I'll say two things. I think you're absolutely right that the surrender was negotiated and perhaps even purchased, right, in advance. Just remember that this is the ISIS model for the capture of significant portions of Iraq as well, right? And so again, we shouldn't be blindsided by the idea that in this context, a military may not have much resolve. And then you add to that the momentum that accumulates, the snowball effect when provincial capital after provincial capital falls. What it makes it look like is that the Taliban is an invincible, lightning fast military force, right? And so if your choice is get some money and get the hell out, or die fighting a fight that you maybe don't view as winnable, you can understand in a sense why the military dissolved. That's at least the picture I'm getting of this story. So I think Flossie, go ahead, remember to unmute. Flossie, I think you're still muted. There you go.
I think, David, the last question torments us. What do we owe the Afghanistan people? They didn't ask our help, we descended upon them. And we descended upon them not necessarily to save them, but because a lot of people had other plans for what they would do in this country. And I think that despite Biden's insistence that we have to withdraw the troops, and I think he's right, he's also well aware that he has to not save the whole country, but he has to bring out as many of the Afghanis who helped us. And I think he and some of the military are working their butts off to see that it happens.
And so that's one debt, right? The debt to the people who directly collaborated with our military. And I think you then draw another concentric circle going further out, the people who worked for the government in capacities that we encouraged them to work in. And then you draw a third concentric circle outwards, the people who took advantage of the liberalizing of Afghani society under US government direction or encouragement. And here you're beginning to talk about girls and women who got educated, who perhaps resumed some liberalization of earlier gender norms that the Taliban had suppressed 20, 30 years earlier. And now part of the issue is you're beginning to talk about a large proportion of Afghani society, right? And so maybe our debt is more immediate and urgent to those who fought with us or to those who directly worked with the government, but I don't think that exhausts it. And I don't think we're necessarily going to be able to get all those people out, right? But how many of those people end up as refugees? And what does that do to the region? Or if they turn up in Europe, what does that do to the prospects for right-wing xenophobic populism in
Yes.
the societies they arrive in, right? I mean, and so let's, be careful not to think that the debt is so narrow that it's something that working really hard the military can discharge in the next month or two. I think it's urgent that they do that work, but that's only the tip of the iceberg, I'm afraid. Wilma, go ahead.
Yeah, in the short term, people in Kabul can't get to the damned airport. And the reason is, or one of the reasons is, that the Taliban forces are a hodgepodge. It's a ragtail group. They're from all over. And I don't know that that the command has command over that entire group, because they're doing it. They seem very undisciplined. They're just behaving, and we can't secure the airport at this time to even get the people who are clamoring to get out. So that's step number one.
Yeah, and it's obviously ragtag guerrilla in terms of a military, but then there's a question about the leadership of the Taliban as well. Is it a unified entity? And so you could say, can the leadership discipline its troops? But even more important would be, is there a unified leadership and decision-making structure, right? And I think, so far as I can tell, we'll have to watch what happens over the coming weeks if some sort of unitary decision-making structure emerges, but it doesn't appear to be there. And I think part of what we're beginning to notice, and again, we're still on bullet point number one. I've got like 5 slides with 6 bullet points in each slide. One of them has to do with the transition from being an insurgent guerrilla campaign to being a government, right? And this is a bit the mirror image of what the US discovered in Afghanistan, that it might not be that difficult for the most powerful military in the world to topple the government and military of Afghanistan. It's much harder to govern, right? And so what will the Taliban run up against as it begins to try to govern Afghanistan? We can get into issues to do with dependency on foreign currency, et cetera. John, go ahead.
Well, Wilma said ragtag, and there's a lot to that. Peggy Noonan's column this morning, which is really terrific, in the Wall Street Journal, called them hopped up Taliban guys. But on the basis of the record, as far as violent takeover, a war to take over a government, this has been one of the least violent that I can remember. I mean, they seem more disciplined than, for example, the police department of Ferguson, Missouri. The number of incidents has been rather small. I mean, the newspapers made a great big deal that they fired in a bunch of protesters. How many countries in the world have protesters been fired at? Newspapers make a big thing about women. I mean, heaven knows I'm on the side of liberation of the Afghanistani women. But who do we compare it to? How about our staunch ally, Saudi Arabia? The Taliban, at least in what they're saying, and so far in most of what they're doing, have been considerably more liberal than the Saudi Arabian government. I mean, as we've said 100 times, David, you and I, I'm a comparativist. I don't see any. The only kind of reasoning I really respect, that appeals to me, is saying, these people did this and these people did that, and how do we weigh that, and what causes the differences? And so far, I would say it certainly could change, but so far, under the context, it seems to me the Taliban has really been pretty disciplined, and also pretty effective.
And I'll add to that then from a comparative point of view, and it's exactly the point that John just made, which is if we're concerned with the girls and women of Afghanistan, as I think we obviously are and should be, where else in the world should we also be concerned about issues to do with patriarchy and gender-based oppression? And
Our own country.
pardon?
Start with our own country.
Start with our own country, yes, and so, yeah, so, right, but the issue here is, I think, not only one of moral concern, but also of efficacy, right? And so, assuming we are concerned, assuming that one lesson of Afghanistan is that military occupation is, first of all, not possible. We're not going to invade Saudi Arabia because of their issues to do with patriarchy, etc. But are there then other ways to pursue this, to pursue a more liberal, democratic, egalitarian agenda that don't involve military occupation? Obviously, we have a heightened obligation to the Afghans because we did invade and occupy and attempt to remake their society for the last 20 years. Let me, and obviously we're not going to be able to do everything today. This seems like we may have to spend another week discussing this. But let us continue with the discussion here. And I want to return to thinking about the decision-making process in the Biden administration. And so perhaps it is right to think that Biden got good information. He made this decision carefully, and he just was misled by bad intelligence, whether that's from the military, the national intelligence community, or the State Department. I'm inclined to not be completely convinced of that, and to think that there were other factors as well. And so impatience and inattention could be factors, right? That Biden wanted to get this done and thought the sooner the better. And so one aspect of this that seems very striking to me, Afghanistan is a society that has a, quote, fighting season, and then that's kind of revealing, right? It indicates that this is a society in which fighting occurs regularly, in which winters are harsh, in which infrastructure is not well developed. And so timing the US withdrawal for the fighting season, for instance, doesn't seem like the most advisable thing to do if you've got some realistic sense of the fragility of the Afghani military and government, right? So it does seem we'll have to get more information, but there are aspects of this decision making that seem to be suspect. I think just standing a long way away and thinking out loud in light of what we now have seen occur. But I also wonder whether domestic political considerations were extremely important in this, right? And so that the predecessor, Donald Trump, had negotiated a withdrawal exclusively with the Taliban without involving the government, right? Had negotiated the withdrawal for a time frame that Joe Biden mainly complied with, that allowed some sharing of responsibility for this, or at least so Joe Biden hoped. And also the fact that if this was going to implode, and it was, I think, Susanna who said, better that this happened quickly than that it happened over a prolonged period. Maybe there was some thought that this could very well be a disaster. Better to get that disaster out of the way early in the presidency, as far as possible from elections. And that those kinds of considerations also explain why it is we withdrew so quickly when we withdrew without seeming to have the contingency plans in place, even to get our citizens out, let alone any kind of planning to try to prop up the Afghani military and regime as long as possible. Third issue here has to do with the fact that I believe, and I believe history will probably conclude that this was a good decision. And to get at the way in which it was a good decision, I think the first thing you've got to ask is kind of a negative question. What were the prospects for success in Afghanistan? What was the mission that US troops were serving, and that our considerable investment of blood and treasure was furthering? Was it coherent? Was it realistic? Was it realizable? And I think when you ask those questions very quickly, it becomes apparent our mission had drifted and drifted and drifted over the course of 20 years, and there was no longer a coherent goal that we were pursuing in Afghanistan. I think it was obvious to almost everyone that we were propping up a government that would not survive without our military and financial assistance, that that government was not popular with the Afghani people, and that it was not winning its campaign. As a matter of fact, it was ceding more and more territory to the Taliban, that the main beneficiaries of our military presence in Afghanistan were the Taliban themselves, who could focus energy on an external enemy, and then China and Russia and Pakistan, all of whom were relying on our presence in different ways to further their own interests. And so from a negative perspective, I think it's hard to make the case that simply remaining in Afghanistan for the indefinite future was the appropriate thing to do. And please note that if you're in that holding pattern, not only are you continuing to divert resources from other agenda, not only are you continuing to sacrifice lives, but you are also preventing a reorientation in policy, right? And this is then beginning to make the positive case. And I think many of you know that the US military now counts global climate change as the single most important threat to American security interests. And we really haven't begun thinking through what the grand strategy is in terms of foreign relations, national security, military policy in a heating planet, in a planet in which there are going to be more and more regular refugee crises, mass movements of people as whole regions become uninhabitable, in which wars over water are going to become the norm, etc. And then you might add to that list China and Iran and Russia, the spread of so-called competitive authoritarianism, and let's not forget cybersecurity, right? There are a whole bunch of other things that are, and John has rightly pointed out that we have a massive national security bureaucracy, but it is nevertheless limited in what it can focus on at what time. Where we attach priorities depends in part on where we are presently engaged. When we are in Afghanistan, it siphons off a certain amount of energy that would, I think, at this juncture be better spent on other problems, more urgent problems. And so ultimately, that's to say that this was a good decision, even if it was poorly executed. We've already talked a fair bit about the speed with which the military dissolved and the government collapsed. I don't think there's more to add there, but I will raise the question of whether or not this will do lasting damage to Biden. Some of you may have seen the article in the New York Times today saying that compassion and competence were the two pillars on which he ran, and neither one of them seems to be abundantly present in the way in which this has been handled so far. And I do think that that's fair, and that Biden appears to have not taken seriously or not figured out the tremendous fragility of the Afghani military before ordering the US military to withdraw, and that many of his responses subsequent to this have been a little flat-footed, a little lacking in empathy. And having said all of that, I think there's a difference between having a bad week or two, right? That happens to almost every president, and a narrative taking hold. And certainly when I talk about not only impatience, but inattention, what I'm referring to is that Joe Biden is clearly focused on the pandemic, on the Delta variant of the coronavirus, on the economic as well as public health dimensions of the pandemic. And then in addition to that, he's also focused on infrastructure and holding together his own rather divided coalition in Congress. And then he's also focused on trying to repair some of the damage that polarization has done to the United States. All of these things, I think, are related to each other. And I don't think that the withdrawal of troops from Afghanistan was close to the top of his priority list. And I do think if he continues to have success in those other ventures, then it's entirely possible that this will be seen as a bad few weeks, as something that was bungled, but not something that does lasting damage. If it is going to do lasting damage, it's going to be because a narrative takes hold in which Joe Biden is not that competent, is not an effective manager, is not an effective decision maker. And please note, that is the campaign message that Trump ran on, Sleepy Joe Biden. It didn't work in 2020. And the fact that Biden is feeding it a little now in 2021 doesn't help things, but I think it's far from clear that this will do lasting damage. As the Times pointed out, if you look at the majority of newspapers outside of the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, they're not even putting Afghanistan on the front page, right? And so how much are we paying attention to this is far from clear. And then we've already talked a little bit about the question, what do we owe the Afghani people, and how in the world can we discharge that debt, I think is in a sense the more difficult, the more abiding question. So let's now talk a little bit about what we learned from the rapidity of the transition from the Ashraf Ghani government to a Taliban regime in Afghanistan. I think it's absolutely clear now, and people have pointed to the corruption of Ashraf Ghani and his government, and I think as you get down to the provincial or regional level, you will see a lot more of this, and the reports that Ghani left the country with suitcases of money, who knows? But I would point out, and I think this is important in the whole discourse on corruption, which has become a very important discourse, in part as the war of terror has progressed, and we've been thwarted in places like Iraq and Afghanistan, that there's a difference between corruption in the context of America, right, where we are used to the rule of law, the preponderance of bureaucratically organized state administrative agencies, where we're primarily an individualistic and contract-based society, where we know when we're trying to slip somebody some money to get something done, that what we're doing is wrong, and that we have to be discreet and careful about it. That's not Afghanistan. And so it's a very different cultural context. It is a gift-giving culture, right? And the idea that in order to marry your child, in order to impress your in-laws, in order to seal a business deal, a gift is simply culturally necessary, that it would be insulting if you didn't, speaks to, I think, that the care we need to exercise in simply playing the corruption card, right? But I do think what is clear is that the leaders that the US supported, and the backing of the US obviously has been extremely important in the success of Afghani leaders, I think, at most levels of government, that we have backed people who were incapable of, as I put it in the next point, unifying a patchwork society. Somebody who rises above the 14 different ethno-language groups that make up Afghanistan. Somebody who can produce a sense of unity in a place that is geographically really just carved out of a British colonial administrative unit, not naturally a cohesive society. And so, yes, corruption was endemic, but it's also the case that we failed to unify Afghanistan, that Afghanistan failed to unify itself, but that reflects the deep lines of division in that society. And this leads then to, I think, the next point. And again, this emphasizes the difficulty not only of nation building, but more generally of occupation and of so-called counterinsurgency warfare, right? We had a successful, quick military campaign in Afghanistan in 2001 and 2002, in which we toppled the Taliban regime and destroyed its military capacity, put al-Qaeda on the run, forced Osama bin Laden into hiding, made it a much less hospitable environment for terrorism, and then the mission began to creep, began to expand, began to transform into recreating Afghani society so that we could leave, right? And not leave a vacuum, not leave chaos, not watch the Taliban reemerge. Lo and behold, 20 years later, what happens? What do we learn from that? I think, among other things, that we tried to build a modern military and a modern governmental regime in a society that was not going to be hospitable to that kind of transplanting, and in which grafting those kinds of institutions does not typically succeed. This British journalist who's written about Iraq, Christopher de Balug, I think is how I say that name, although I'm not sure. Somebody maybe will correct me. Uses this phrase that's been used by various Middle Eastern scholars, clanism, for the description of a kind of kin network-based social solidarity and governance, that one follows the leadership, respects the authority and the decisions, not of central statewide actors, but of actors within one's own kin network. They are the ones who have legitimate authority over you. And if they aren't part of that network, then they are potentially hostile, certainly not to be trusted. How do you create a successful, integrated military out of people whose primary loyalty is to their kin group or clan and not to the state, not to the country not to the institutions that serve state and country, right? Similarly, how do you create national governance? And what we learned in Iraq and Afghanistan is that the successful approach seems to be attempting to use in a kind of pooled sovereignty model the kin and clan networks, but that means you need fundamentally different structures. So to put this in a slightly different way, it's one thing for a society to slowly and organically transition into the forms of governance that we associate with modern government. It's another thing to attempt to transplant those institutions. What we seem to be learning again and again, and let me be careful, who's the we who's learning, maybe what we seem to be stubbornly refusing to learn is that these institutions assume a certain social and cultural context that may not be applicable in the places in the world where we try to furnish new regimes, try to support nation building. And you add to that the fact that Afghanistan has 14 different distinct languages and ethnic groups, that they have Sunnis and Shia and Sufis, and that they have never really treated themselves as a unified country. And this means that this is a very difficult enterprise. And I think one of the things we should be really focusing on is how it is that 20 years later, when journalists and scholars are so clear about this, it appears that important elements of the military and the national security and diplomatic corps are far less clear about this. And I just have to wonder out loud, more a question than anything else, whether, to use Daniel Rogers' phrase, in the age of fracture, there's so much mutual mistrust and suspicion between the military and scholars, between the military and the academy, between the national security apparatus and journalists, that we're not learning from each other, that we're not correcting each other's mistakes. And then I'll conclude with a really big question. Let's assume that terror and terrorism are going to remain a threat. And the title of today's lecture is this the way the war on terror ends? I have a lot more I wanted to say on this in general, but I do think that if we go back to the Iliad, if we go back to classical Indian descriptions of warfare, terrorism has been around as long as we've been recording history, really, right? And so, of course, terror is going to persist, and the technology that we have, which both allows it to be much more destructive and also for the imagery that it generates to be instantly viewed throughout the world, to recruit and indoctrinate and radicalize via social media, etc. We should not assume that terror is going to go away. But I also think we're learning reluctantly, slowly, far from thoroughly, but we are learning about the problem with using traditional military techniques, which are designed not for asymmetric warfare, where your enemy is a technique, it's not a state actor, is not militarily organized, might be a lone wolf, might be a cell, might or might not have a social media presence, how hard it is to fight terror with military means. And I do think one of the things that we might consider would be the way in which the Israelis react to terror. And I do think, and this is also relevant to thinking about the coronavirus, that part of what dictated what I think many of us now think was our overreaction to the attacks of September 11th, 2001, is that this was a novel experience for us. We had not been subjected to this kind of terrorism ever before in our history, and that we tend to overreact to new risks, right? That we are not accustomed to them. We do not weigh them calculatively, rationally, carefully. We see them as enormous because they are things we are unaccustomed to. And that we may need to become a little bit more tolerant of the risk of terror if the alternative is a campaign that is sustained, seemingly endless, right? This has been called an endless war. And that we maybe instead should redirect our energy to building institutions, to thinking about not just fighting terror. And again, I'm not getting into it today, but I think one of the things that if we pull back and think carefully about, we will see is that our efforts to combat terror have probably created more enemies than allies, have probably strengthened terrorist networks more than they have weakened them, that we end up then doing again, right? Fighting, using drone strikes, using targeted assassination that ends up killing innocents, more things that generate more enemies, more hostility, more suspicion of the United States, that make our mission in this battle all the harder. And so as opposed to a military approach, maybe we need to start thinking about an approach that involves building institutions, using the law, using a more cosmopolitan orientation to thinking about how we can work with other societies to address common threats. I'll stop there. Like I say, just really touching the beginning of this discussion. You guys were great today. You had lots of questions, lots to contribute. Maybe we'll have to come back to this next week and continue the conversation. Any questions, thoughts before we call it a day?
I'd like to say something.
Go ahead, Bonnie.
As Jeanette Rankin said, you can no more win a war than you can win an earthquake.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. All right. So general skepticism. I have to say, you know, when we think about World War II, I think maybe that war, you know, at tremendous cost, was necessary, was won, was a good war. And so I have to say, I'm not entirely convinced that we eliminate war as a potentially legitimate instrument of politics. But having said that, yes, I think especially when you have the largest, most sophisticated, most expensive military in the world, you're inclined to think that using it is the best approach to solving problems. Bob, go ahead, and then I'll come back to you, Joanne.
Yeah, this is perhaps a small point given what we've just been discussing, but the governance of Afghanistan by the Taliban, they have great advantages that they know the people, they know the territory, they are much more involved with the culture than we ever were or ever would be. But given that they've got this balkanization, poor word, but you know, so many different clans and so on, will they be able to accomplish it? And what is their organizing principle? It seems to be Islamism, but there's so many different aspects of that. So I don't know how that's going to happen.
Yeah, and my concluding questions, I had two of them. One is the Taliban of 2021 the same as the Taliban of 20 years ago? right? And so I think we have to, and John pointed out that they were actually relatively disciplined so far. There's been not the kind of systematic vendetta that you sometimes see when a guerrilla force takes over the capital, right? And so who knows? Maybe they're not quite what they used to be. And then my other question is Afghani society the same as it was 20 years ago? And here we could start with technology, right? The idea that they have the internet, they have cell phones, they have exposure to the rest of the world as a result. But then we can also point out that over the last 20 years, they've grown accustomed to considerable foreign aid investment, right? And that they have built schools and universities and created expertise and built some modern infrastructure. And if the Taliban have to become the government of Afghanistan, as opposed to just an insurgent military force, how do they manage that? How do they satisfy their population? And can they do so if they remain a primarily Pashtun Sunni Islamicist clique, right? Or are they going to have to enter a coalition with other segments of Afghani society in order to be able to rule effectively in 2021? I'm sorry. I saw another question. Was that Joanne? Go ahead.
Many years ago, the government of Afghanistan brought a linguist from the University of Hawaii over to their country, to Afghanistan, to set up a language program. I've often wondered what the nature of that program was, whether it was an attempt to bring a number of different cultures and languages together. It might be interesting to find out if that was their intent.
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that. And if you want to report back to us next week, if you figure it out, I'd love to learn. If I've got world enough in time, maybe I'll do a little snooping also. John, go ahead.
The other word to use in the transformation of Afghan society is urbanization. It's
Yes,
a far more urban country, as well as more educated and everything than it was. And the state, you listen to a couple of the press conferences of Taliban people, and they seem to be well aware of that, which isn't to say they're going to know what to do about it. Actually, the comment I started to make was about 3 or 4 minutes ago when you're talking about the American military. The other thing to note about the American military is that they haven't really won a war since Grenada and Panama.
Those I won't make light of those victories, but they were not up against formidable enemies, and they.
I wasn't trying to take the victories. I was trying to be a little bit sarcastic, but I mean the point is we do have this enormous military. We spend more than the next 15 countries in the world on the military, combined, and yet as a military body, their record is not terrific by any means. I mean, it's counting the Pentagon, but it's everybody. It really has been a long story of failure.
Yeah, and I guess one question would be, do we measure the success of the military exclusively in terms of the wars it wins, right? Or is it doing more in the world? And so here I'm, thinking of the jungle grows back, right? The idea that if the U.S. military weren't present in all the theaters that it is, that bad actors would be making mischief in a hurry, right? That's the argument. I think that you got to counter if you want to, as I certainly do, spend less money on the military. let's just note in passing, and maybe this can be a concluding thought for the day, that the US spends more on police than most societies in the world spend on their militaries, right? And so if you put our police budgets and our military budgets together, we are a highly militarized society, and there's a huge opportunity cost in terms of where those resources aren't going. All right, everybody, wonderful as always being with you. I wish it could have been in person, but I will see you again on Zoom next week. Please take care of yourselves, and maybe we can continue with the same topic next week. Bye, everybody. Thanks.